For this episode of Scholar Talks, the guiding question is how did Paul Nitze's work on Cold War national security policy support American ideals and aspirations? Our guest, James Graham Wilson, is an historian with the U.S. State Department, editing volumes on arms control, national security, and foreign policy. He is the author of The Triumph of Improvisation, Gorbachev's Adaptability, Reagan's Engagement, and the End of the Cold War. And today's topic, his most recent book, America's Cold Warrior, Paul Nitze and National Security from Roosevelt to Reagan. I am Tony Williams, and I am pleased to bring you another episode of Scholar Talks in the America 250 series. James, I want to thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Tony.
Sure. I love this book for a couple of reasons. One is, he's such a compelling and interesting figure, Paul Nitze, and his public service just spans the entire history of the Cold War, all the way from its very beginning, sort of at the end of World War II, all the way up through the Reagan administration and fall of the Berlin Wall and fall of the Soviet Union. So he's just so interesting. But also, I love the fact that you tie it to the idea that his public career was tied to was in the service of something. In other words, that it was supportive of American ideals, American aspirations, American principles, as were many of the other policymakers during the Cold War in the post-war period.
Oh, yes, thank you so much. So Paul Nitze, just to kind of give a brief overview of the person, he, uh, as you say, is there until the end of the Cold War. Even before that, he had started out as an investment banker on Wall Street in the 1930s, and one of his mentors was a man named James Forrestal, whom
Hmm.
President Roosevelt, in the year or two leading up to the U.S. entry into World War II, had summoned to Washington, D.C. in a way to kind of make nice with Wall Street and to kind of prepare for the possibility that the U.S. would enter the war. And one of the first things that Forrestal did was to call on Paul Nitze to come down to Washington. It was sort of be there, be here on Monday morning, and Paul Nitze showed up. And from that moment onward, throughout the 40s to the 1990s, Paul Nitze really tackled hard national security challenges, and he just never stopped doing that. And toward the end of his life, he was interviewed in the early 90s. They said, "Well, you've made all this money on Wall Street. You've also been at the Reykjavik summit all night with when Reagan and Gorbachev had their famous encounter." And they said, which one was more exciting? He said, well, there's no question. It was, first of all, there's no question that it was exciting to make money on Wall Street. But even more exciting was, to be in these negotiations, working on matters of war and peace, trying to reduce the prospect of a nuclear war. And I think that to your point about uh, the service of ideals, the document that Paul Nitze will always be, remembered for is his stewardship and authorship of parts of, but overall stewardship of something called NSC 68 in the first few months of 1950. And NSC 68, I recommend for everyone to kind of Google it and read through. It's a beautiful articulation of fundamental American ideals and values, kind of looking back at the founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and the Constitution, and then kind of framing those in terms of the some called 30 years crisis, whatever you want to call it, the kind of World War One into war and World War Two, and looking at the world in 1950 and looking at the threats to these ideals and what do we need to do about it. There are many Cold War. Well, it is remains a kind of Cold War foundational document, but I think that going forward, if you look at national security strategies more recently, you don't get the same kind of exploration and articulation of what are the fundamental values that we're trying to protect.
Right. Interesting. Well, thank you for that sketch of his life. So how does his work, and that leads me right to my next question. How does his work on NSC 68 reflect his thinking? And how does it help to alter Cold War national strategy policy?
Well, so yes, Nitze had been involved with a previous project, which was the strategic two iterations of the strategic bombing survey during
Mhm.
World War II as it was happening. First, in the European theater, looking at the, the kind of U.S. strategic bombing of German industries. But then, very interestingly, and I think very important to him, as the war ends in the Pacific in 1945, he remains on the team, so to speak, for this second iteration of the strategic bombing survey uh, to look at the U.S. response or U.S. strategic bombing of Japan, but looking at it from the frame of sort of after it happened, right? So the
Mhm.
Japan has surrendered, and almost as an aside, President Truman says to Nitze on his way over, while you're at it, try to figure out why they attacked us in the first place. And Nitze really ran with that, and it built it out in his final report, which came out in 1946. And he was very, I think, very clear in his line that the reason why Imperial Japan attacked the United States in December of 1941 at Pearl Harbor was because of a fundamental U.S. weakness. This thought was that we had let down our strength, and the Americans, people or president would basically accept some form of surrender. And the kind of the lesson from that was that weakness was provocative. Never again can we allow this to happen. And it's interesting. It could have for you know history wonks. It's a little bit funny in 1946 that Nitze tries to he's kind of looking out at what's going on with the Soviet Union and the collapse of the wartime alliance against Nazi Germany, and he's trying to make these points, and people, Dean Acheson among others, tell him no, you're just seeing things, because he wasn't really the world's best writer, and so he's kind of writing this in a stilted manner. And then, around the same time, a little bit afterwards, George Kennan writes his long telegram, which the same people, same mentors to Nitze, like James Forrestal, tell everybody they need to read. And it's essentially saying a number of the same things, but it's far better written and easier to read. And then so if you fast forward a few years to NSC 68, I think what he's the experience and the memories are quite similar, and what he's trying to do specifically, the specific charge in NSC 68 is to think about like how to protect American values in the
Mhm.
world where the Soviets now have the atomic bomb, which we know from the fall of 1949, indisputably they now possess the bomb. And then B, in a world where there is the potential of each side achieving uh, a hydrogen bomb, or pursuing or achieving a hydrogen bomb, which is it may seem like a subtle distinction, but it's the difference between an atomic bomb and a hydrogen bomb is quite profound, and the prospect of you know something that would I suppose even though we think of the atomic bombings and the cities in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we're approaching the anniversary of it. I think by that point, in the kind of mid 40s, the year or two afterwards, it's still considered to be a kind of a military to military thing, whereas a hydrogen bomb would be a city destroying type of weapon. And so, thinking about in that type of world, what are the things that we, the United States, need to do to protect itself and the free world?
Mhm. Very good. And a follow-up to that, I guess there's some sense maybe out there that some of the early Cold War was a little bit more focused maybe on economic aid, specifically like the Marshall Plan. But then NSC 68, I think some people argue it seems to sort of militarize Cold War policy. Is that accurate or?
It, let me say a few things about that. So
Sure.
on the Marshall Plan. So first of all, Nitze is very much involved in the Marshall Plan. He worked in the early Cold War, just jump around a little bit here. In 1946, 47, I think one of the points I try to make in the book is that a lot of other people sort of go back to their pre-wartime employment,
Mm,
whether that's on Wall Street as a banker or a lawyer. And Nitze himself was given the opportunity to go back to be an investment banker again and probably make a lot more money on Wall Street. He turns it down in 46. He wants to work on post-war issues and is primarily rebuilding the Europe and the European economy, the Marshall Plan. But I think very importantly, in this kind of distinction between Nitze and uh,
mm,
Kennan self-avowedly thought that we needed to focus on four or five specific core areas in the world. And, Nitze who had had a kind of different experience during World War II, and I lay this out in the book that he's, riding through the jungles in South America trying to find, I guess what we would call strategic, critical minerals today, which I guess they were back then too. But his kind of he had a very sort of sense of the Cold War as a global thing from the start. And so
mm,
there's kind of two axes, I guess people rightly consider, NSC 68. One, it's going to be a global conflict, not just something that's limited to, Central Europe and Germany. And that two, yes, I mean militarily, right after the war ends in 1945, there's an intense effort to draw down US military spending, to demobilize.
mm,
And whereas the Soviets really never demobilized. And this then Secretary of Defense, Louis Johnson, and this is part of the kind of the 1950 the framework here. He had promised Harry Truman that he would limit defense spending to like something like $13 billion. And what Nitze was trying to do, and he skillfully co-opted a number of key figures in the defense establishment, was to kind of make the case that we needed a dramatic increase
mm.
in U.S. military spending. And originally, in the spring of 1950, President Truman didn't want to deal with this. He didn't want to think about it because he had his own domestic, priorities. He wanted, do his own version of the kind of FDR New Deal. He wanted healthcare, some kind of system like that. And it wasn't until June of 1950, with the um, beginning of the Korean War, North Korea's invasion of South Korea, that it really seemed at the time, and this is I think kind of hard. It's even hard. It's hard for me to fathom. Well, a lot of things are hard for me to fathom, but I mean, like trying to kind of get into the mindset of what it was like to be in Washington, D.C. in June of 1950. It seemed like the start of the Third World War. I mean, we know now today that the war would ultimately be a limited thing and would not involve the use of atomic weapons, but that was certainly something on the table at the time, and it really seemed like the start of a Third World War. And it was only after that Truman signed off on it in NSC 68.
Right. Okay. Well, speaking of that, my next question is about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, what is Nitz's role in that crisis, and how does it alter the Cold War and the arms race? I think you see it as sort of a watershed moment.
Yeah, so the October of 1962, Nitze at this point is the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. He's the equivalent of what would today be the Undersecretary of Defense for policy. And that man actually at the moment is Elbridge Colby, who's sort of the top policy advisor to the secretary. And Nitze, just to kind of a little piece of flavor here, one of the things that's very interesting to me in when he's meeting with McNamara and the president, and this is all in our foreign relations volumes, it, McNamara will say something to President Kennedy, and Nitze will then say that he disagrees with that. And it's always amusing to me. I mean, this man who works as Secretary of Defense is disagreeing with him. But I say that because it's a good kind of, you have to think about that, the sort of personal dynamics in terms of, what becomes then the most dangerous crisis the world has ever seen, which is the 13 days in October. Uh,
Mhm.
Nitze, this is also a kind of fun thing as a historian because he writes about the Cuban Missile Crisis as to be expected in his memoir in the early 1990s. Um, from Hiroshima to Glasnost is his memoir. And
Mm,
he's broadly speaking, he's favorable of President Kennedy's handling of the crisis. And it's important, data point that and I'll say this personally, I first really got interested in the Cold War in college through a class on Cold War history in which we did a simulation of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we
mm,
read all of the transcripts of the audio recorded transcripts. And I came away thinking, you know, goodness, this is the best run crisis. These people
mm,
knew exactly what they were doing. And, uh, you know, ultimately, sorry, this is a very long-winded way of getting your question, but
mm,
Nitz's Nitz's actual sense of things, being in the room, being on this executive committee, was that the Kennedy administration, the Kennedy and his brother, waffled from the start, and that it took the insertion of Nitz's former boss, Dean Acheson, who a few days into it comes into the room and where few people had been willing to make any decisions, he just kind of sat down and was this figure of command. I mean, there's an incredible moment when they're talking about like, the meaning of an embargo versus a quarantine.
mm,
Embargo has a kind of it's a associated with it legally as a declaration of war. And the then State Department legal advisor is going on about this, and Dean Acheson apparently just slams his fist down and says, the law is what American says it is, or something like that. I mean, this is in Nitze's notes, and then in Nitze's own like interviews when he's working with his co-authors for the book. He's being much more candid and much more critical of the Kennedy folks than ultimately he wrote about at the time. But anyway, there's a universe of things to explore here, and
mm,
it also is amusing to me. And what I think one of the things that is just remarkable about JFK during this time period, even though I had become sort of more critical about a lot of the feeling more critical about a lot of the decisions. First, starting with the fact that the Republican senator, Senator Keating, a few months earlier had said there was proof that the Soviets were putting missiles into Cuba, and they sort of the administration somehow got away with just dismissing that out of hand. It's kind of unbelievable. But I mean, the thing remarkable and amazing thing about JFK is that throughout the entire crisis, he stays polite, calm, with a few exceptions. And that is, one person he's not polite to is Paul Nitze. And
mm.
it's wonderful. I encourage, folks interested in this to kind of, narrow in on the Kennedy tapes, the exchanges with Kennedy and Paul Nitze. It's very clear that, Nitze was not in the inner circle. But to your question, I mean, it's a defining moment to Paul Nitze in his worldview and his sense of priorities, again, to this theme of protecting American values and American homeland, which was that at the end of the day, Nitze, who had been railing throughout the 1950s against the prospect of the Soviets getting strategic and conventional superiority, at the end
Mm,
of the day, the Soviet Union backed down because of American strength in October of 1962. And there's an incredible line from a Soviet diplomat who says to an American, I think it was to Bob Lovett shortly afterwards, he said, "You will never do this to us again."
mm,
Meaning that, never again would the Soviet Union allow itself to be in this position of strategic and conventional inferiority. And then we see that play out. I mean, there's a fundamental. So by the end of the 1960s, you have, in terms of the striking power, number of missiles, all of these metrics, you have a rough equivalence. And in some cases, the Soviet Union pulls ahead. And I try to make the point in the book that there's kind of two different ways of interpreting why the Cuban Missile Crisis ended peacefully, um, and what it meant going forward. And the one that kind of wins out is Bob McNamara's view that the two sides got to the point where they were looking down over a cliff, and then they said, "Well, we know what's down there. We're going to pull ourselves back, and we're never going to go up to that point again." And from Nitze's perspective, this was exactly the wrong approach. I mean, the approach was that ultimately the Soviets backed down because of U.S. strength, that this was a stabilizing factor, and that we needed to kind of sustain that strength. Whereas ultimately what happened was that McNamara sort of unilaterally limited the number of U.S. Minutemen to 1,000, and obviously the Vietnam experience through a whole is a key part of the narrative. And um, but I mean, I think just that's where I try to make the case that from that point onward, Nitze becomes singularly focused on this, the strategic balance and in wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right, right. Great. And so, and then there's, obviously a huge Soviet massive buildup, as you mentioned, and of course the SALT Treaty. But then, what was, his thinking about the Cold War and the arms race in light of those events during the Reagan administration, and how was he involved in crafting that arms control policy? Especially, we talked earlier about SDI, Star Wars, and all of that.
So this is a I think to, for folks who are interested in um, careers in public service, as I hope folks are, um, there's an overriding theme here in the book, which is that George Kennan has gotten a lot more attention. As I said earlier, he was a better writer than Paul Nitze. Um, but George Kennan left in a snit in at the end of 1949. And for about 40 years, he wrote very critically about U.S. policy, much of it on the theme of that he had gotten everything right and people then messed it up after he left. He wrote wonderful books, wonderful history books. He's just a wonderful, wonderful writer. But he really never commanded the attention of U.S. presidents from that moment on, in terms of like what should we do or what are the big terms of the debates. And that's where Paul Nitze stayed in the game throughout this entire period. And I actually think that, while he'll always probably be remembered for NSC 68, it was his greatest moment, I think, was those years during the Reagan administration when he
Mm,
was fundamentally, you know, important, both in negotiating what became the 1987 INF agreement, but also creating this strategic framework, excuse me, in 1985, which is basically a three or four sentence or three or four paragraphs about like how do you reconcile the president's aspirations for a world without nuclear weapons, for building strategic defenses, for making sure that NATO remains together, making sure that the American people support the national security objectives, and making sure that the Soviets stay at the table.
mm,
So first of all, you have to kind of frame it, and it becomes this three-phased approach of how you also stay within the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and you know he's staying close then to Secretary of State George Shultz, and he also commanded the respect of President Reagan, who really, regarded him as kind of a throwback to the Truman Big D Democrats and the kind of this moment at the start of the Cold War when there was kind of more of a sense of moral clarity and a sense of what, the United States needed to do. And, over time, that this is all blurred a bit, but there was a kind of mutual attraction at the late 70s between Reagan and Nitze. And Nitze, and what did it mean? Well, it one thing it meant is that Nitze could get away with stuff, right? I mean, he partly because of his financial independence, but also because he had this kind of status with the president. That there's this famous moment in the summer of 1982, this walk in the woods episode where Paul Nitze is in Geneva and he meets kind of secretively with his Soviet counterpart. They go out into the woods, either in the French across the French border, I forget. But
mm,
the point is that he goes rogue, so to speak. That he's given a set of instructions and he comes up with his own proposal.
mm,
and he broaches it with the Soviets, and he sends it back, back to DC. And there's quite a bit of harumphing about it, because
mm,
he's hasn't followed his instructions. But I kind of make the point. I try to make the point that President Reagan, first of all, is not going to fire him because he's just somebody who he regards him as an expert, somebody who has his credentials. But I also try to make the point in the book that Reagan considers this. I mean, he says, well, what about this idea? That's not a it's not what I'm asking for, but it's not a bad idea. And so that's where I think that, you know, there's a lot that has to go into kind of putting yourself into the position where somebody say, well, that person, if they think it's a good idea, I know it's not just motivated by their kind of partisan politics. I know that they're not just out there on, Twitter writing this, that, or the other thing, that they're somebody who really they thought hard about the issue and they thought, well, this is something that might work, and they're willing to take the risk. And so I really kind of admire about that. But it's difficult. It's hard to kind of get into that position. But I mean, to me, you can tell it's exciting to know that you can kind of stay at this, and that your legacy, your record of achievement, can accrue over time.
excellent. So, going back to the guiding question, something we've touched upon, how did Paul Nitz's work on Cold War national security policy support American founding ideals and aspirations?
I think that, you know, there was a fundamentally for him, especially in the second half of his career, it when it came to the nuclear balance, it was about preserving the United States freedom of action, and that was a kind of prerequisite for preserving individual freedoms at
Mm,
home. And it's he's somebody who I don't find a lot of him sort of on the record about what's going on domestically in the
mm,
60s and 70s, but his singular focus really was on, you know, this broader, I guess, sort of two pillars, I would put it. And these are thematically, they unite Nitze and Kennan and many others who at the dawn of the Cold War. And the first was, if you had a successful strategy to contain, reverse, whatever, communism, which was fundamentally antithetical to human freedom. If you had
mm,
a strategy to do these things, then ultimately you could win without war, right? NSC 68 was not a document about how to fight a war. It was how to prevent a war. That was the aspiration.
mm,
And then the second one was that in terms of the what becomes this Nitze scenario, it's this sense that this in the 70s, you know, that the Soviet leader would be able to kind of blackmail an American president and America more broadly by saying, well, we have the ability to take out your land-based nuclear missiles,
mm,
sparing your cities. This is a very grisly thing to consider. And that then we would say to you, okay, here's the deal. If you retaliate, we will take out your cities.
mm,
So the best thing to do is surrender. And I think that Nitz's is this kind of hard to kind of find all the fine grain evidence, but this is a kind of my extrapolation of everything Nitz's thinking was that he believed that no American president all American presidents would back down in that situation
mm,
because I mean the American people elected somebody, and the American people don't elect somebody who's going to make the decision, okay, I'm just going to flip the switch and there goes New York City. And that more importantly, the Soviets knew that about America and the fundamental nature, fundamental ideals, and the kind of the ideals that instill us to vote people to protect them, and that would allow them to take all sorts of risks. Now that they had nuclear equivalency, or in some categories superiority. I mean, that's kind of hovers over all of Nitz's ideas in the 70s and 80s, to the point where he's very gloomy and he can't really,
mm.
comprehend that Gorbachev is somebody different. And then, 1 or 2 weeks before the Berlin Wall comes down, he's still railing against how Gorbachev's never going to let this happen. So, there's a sense of, complexity here, and I went into this project thinking I'm either going to fall in love or grow to despise this man, and that's the kind of dilemma of anybody writing a biography. Um, and but I don't I feel like I got through it without that, but I do think that there's kind of the downsides and upsides to this person, as with anybody. But the upside is the perseverance, the just continual sense of hacking away at these very hard problems. Unfortunately, some of them have kind of popped that back up on the scene during our lifetime.
Right. Well, that's a great lesson for all of us, right? Perseverance in the face of adversity, and that the world is a very complex place. So, James, I want to thank you very much for joining us to share insights on your book and this very important topic.
Thank you so much, Tony.
Great, and thank you all for joining us for this episode of Scholar Talks. Check out the other videos in our America 250 series on the BRI channel.